Well, good morning on a pretty cold Saturday morning. Looking forward to another two of these the next 2 days, but even colder, 0 and 1 degree I believe. I wish global warming would hurry up and get here. It's a little slow in this country. This week I thought I'd turn to an idea that I came across while investigating ideas about a depopulation agenda. Reading a few of the articles that I researched, occasionally the phrase the Great Replacement would be used, or Great Replacement theory, and at the time I had no idea what that was, and as ever when you see something that intrigues you, what's that all about? I thought I'd investigate. So I started reading into what this theory was and trying to find out if it had any basis in fact, any reality behind it. Now it seems that the theory, or modern day iteration of it, anyway, I started with a guy called Renaud Camus, a French writer, and he wrote the book Le Grand Remplacement in I think it's 2011, and in the book he complains much about modern life and much about how so many things have become just power imitations of the reality. There's a lovely long piece actually where he shows how everything genuine and real is being replaced by the false, the artificial, the ersatz. And yes, it's a lovely piece, but at the end of that piece he goes into the more controversial aspect, which is the idea that the population of Europe, but particularly of France, is being replaced by people coming mainly from North Africa and Central Africa. And that's what he calls Le Grand Remplacement. It's stirred quite a debate in France, and to this day it's still controversial, but at least it's kind of in the public sphere. And interestingly, it's met with quite a lot of agreement in France. I read a poll relating to it that about 69%, which is an incredibly high number, considering how controversial the idea is, 69% of French people believe that some kind of replacement of the native French population is actually going on. The figures aren't actually that, well, for France it's kind of a little bit difficult because as ever with these things, when the figures become embarrassing, they stop collecting the figures. I think in France now they don't take the figures. It stopped when it was around about, I think 13% of the population were not French natives. But that was several years ago. Personally, I visited Paris in 2018. Had quite a nice time, but challenging. I'd been in Paris some 20 years before that. That was the previous time, to see the finish of the Tour de France, and enjoyed it hugely. And I only about 4 or 5 days, but it was a lot of fun. But going back to Paris in 2018, it was kind of obvious, in your face if you will, that the place had changed quite drastically. Whole areas had been taken over by particularly North African cultures, and you saw the kind of manifestations of their culture everywhere, and Paris was essentially not very French. I suppose you could say much the same of London these days. London is not very English in character anymore. The buildings of course remain, some of the institutions, but essentially going to London now is not that much of a pleasure, because you feel a stranger in your own land. And to some extent you are almost like an outsider from a different culture. But this phenomenon is, in countries where I've actually got data, those that do collect it, the numbers are quite scarily high. Germany's a fairly good example. I believe it's 21% of the population now are, or current population, were not born within the German borders. And of course that's not including second generation, third generation people who are from outside cultures who make a living or live in Germany. Anyway, I looked at Sweden, because I know the numbers are quite high there, but the Swedish government have also pulled the same trick of not collecting data once the figures became a little too embarrassing for the Swedish government. But they stopped it around about 20%, and this was before the mass migration of 2015. So the figures now are probably in the mid-30s at least, which is kind of strange when you think of what comes to mind when you think of Sweden and Swedish culture, how drastically it's changing. And of course they've got massive increases, of course, it's unfair, but they have got massive increases in crimes of violence and sex-related crime. Unfortunately, we pulled much the same trick, the British government pulled much the same trick after the Brixton riots many years ago, when they used to collect data about the ethnic background of offenders. But after, I think it was the Brixton riots, they stopped doing it because the figures were showing that a much higher rate amongst some communities of committing crime than the local, than the native population. So that particular fact, statistical fact, was inconvenient to the narrative of multiculturalism. So they simply stopped collecting the statistics. And in papers nowadays, newspapers routinely refuse to give descriptions of perpetrators, even when those perpetrators are at large and members of the public at risk. They still refuse to give descriptions for fear of reinforcing other narratives, ones they don't really like. So it gets problematical. Now, one of the things you'll notice if you do research the Great Replacement, particularly on YouTube actually, is that you'll find that several mass killings in America, I think El Paso, Buffalo, and there was another one I can't recall for now, but several examples of people who are supposed to have been inspired by the idea of the white population, in America's case, being replaced by foreigners of one sort or another, or who people they regard as foreigners. Interestingly, a lot of the videos as well, they link it to a terrible atrocity in Norway, where a guy called Anders Breivik, I think his name was, murdered something like 77 people, I think it was. Terrible crime. And they link it to the book The Great Replacement, or Le Grand Remplacement. Unfortunately for those who do that, the Breivik's killings took place before the book was published, and it was only published in French at the time. So pretty unlikely that had anything to do with Mr. Breivik. But so it's this thing of tarring. Well, it's fair enough to some extent. If somebody does something in the name of something else, then it's fair enough to associate it, I think. But the idea is to simply tar the concepts of the Great Replacement, and to stop people looking at it in the round. Does it have any evidence? Is it a valid theory? So it's often referred to in the most derogatory terms. Morning. And it's hard to get, particularly on YouTube, but throughout the internet generally, it's quite hard to get a sane and balanced view of what Renaud Camus was actually talking about. Now, personally, I've not read the book yet, though I am trying to read a kind of version of it called We Will Not Be Replaced, I think it's called. Or You Will Not Replace Us. And it's quite an interesting read. It comes out with some interesting historical facts, some of which were quite shocking. I give one example. It refers to an incident in World War II when Moroccan and North African troops generally, who were on our side fighting with the Free French, after the Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944, I think it was, battle took place in January, but it took months to get through. So by about May 1944, when the battle was over, these troops who were on our side, on the side of the Allies, took part in a rampage and massive, I don't know what you call it, a rape fest. They literally raped tens of thousands of local Italian women, girls and children. The most terrible war crime, really, but yeah, it's been airbrushed from history to some extent, it would seem. It's not referred to, but pretty awful behaviour. What kind of culture would spawn such people who would take part in such an act? It went on for weeks, and terrible, terrible atrocity. But I didn't know anything about it until reading Camus' book. So yeah, it's quite interesting. It's also quite. The guy tried to write it in English, and his English is okay. He makes quite a few mistakes as he's doing it, but it's entertaining. It's well composed, well thought out, and challenging. Now, I personally feel I don't know enough. I don't know enough to say one thing or t'other, whether this is a real thing or not. I suppose the central question is whether this is just a kind of natural process. The replacement that's going on, the massive amounts of immigration going on, particularly since 2015 throughout Europe and Britain, I suppose, as well. Is it just coincidence, brought about by the usual incompetence of politicians, which we know all too well, unfortunately, throughout the world? Corruption reigns. Or is there a deeper, darker plan behind it? That's the critical point. We can bemoan the incompetence. People make mistakes. It's temporary political convenience to be satisfied, elections to win, all that sort of thing. That's one thing. But of course, if it's a deliberate policy, which is Camus' idea, then it's a totally different kettle of fish. Is this being planned, and if so, why? There's a guy called Matteo Salvini in Italy. He puts it down to economics. He feels that people are not going to want to pay, or if you don't have to pay Italian workers, I don't know, 25 euros an hour, whatever you're paying your Italian worker, you can get away with paying an immigrant 2 or 3 euros an hour. It's going to be economically advantageous to certain business interests to do that. It's a cynical view of it, but I mean, we've seen in this country in the incidents in Leicester how ruthless business owners will take advantage of people who are often vulnerable, especially if they're illegal immigrants. Had similar incidents in our country, in my country. He also feels though that it's financed because they're delivered to Italy, I think it's Lampedusa if I remember rightly, on boats en masse, and the boats take a lot of money to organise and there's a lot of logistics involved in getting that number of people across the Mediterranean, and yet it's done on a regular basis, ongoing over years now. And he hints at dark forces, Mr. Salvini hints at dark forces behind this with pretty unpleasant motives. So yeah, other politicians, Eric Zemmour, who was he's a political journalist in France. He ran for election recently as president and did quite well. In the end, he had to give up. He didn't reach the final stages, but he attracted a fair amount of support. Who else can I mention? It's been, it's been of interest to quite a few mainstream and not so mainstream politicians. I suppose you could make a case for saying that that Trump. I don't know if he was inspired by it or directly in any way, but certainly the problems on the border with Mexico, where Mexico borders Texas, have been of interest or concern to people living in America. It was quite odd, that situation. It's become odder. Trump tried to do something about it. The Republican Party seems quite concerned, whereas the Democrats seem blissfully unconcerned. In fact, they seem to be positively encouraging it. It was interesting during the time of COVID that America is one of the more drastic countries with lockdowns and masks and needing to prove you were vaccinated, and in some cases, for many people, COVID vaccines. There was an awful lot of that going on, but oddly, for a government that seems so concerned with these measures, they didn't apply them to these illegal immigrants coming in. They didn't have proof of vaccination. They didn't need to even take tests. They just let them in. Strange, isn't it? If you believe COVID was a real thing, in the sense, it existed, but was it the threat that it was painted to be? It's kind of quite debatable, really. But the US government were constantly telling us how dangerous it was, telling their people how dangerous it was. At the same time, they happily let thousands and thousands of unvaccinated, untested people into the country. Very odd behaviour. So, I suppose in summary, what it comes down to is the motivation for this stuff. Is it, like in this case, the Democrats' case, they feel that if they can let enough of these people in, they will be so grateful to the Democratic Party that they're likely to vote for it in the future, hence changing the electoral likelihoods in America. I suppose number two is it simply an economic thing, whereby you take advantage, or people try to take advantage of the cheap labour. That's the second most likely, I suppose. The third one is the darkest of them all, where there is the idea that there is quite a deliberate process going on to replace the native population. It's a very dark idea, and this is the essence of what Camus is on about. Are they simply trying to get rid of the native populations of places like Germany, France, Netherlands, Sweden, obvious one, to some extent the UK as well, and replace them, or at least mix them up so much with another culture that they become something quite totally different? It's sort of a kind of, it's a word that's been in the media a lot lately, but it's a kind of cultural genocide, whereby you take away the sense of Britishness or Englishness, or being a German, or being a French person, for heaven's sake. I mean, that's one of the strongest identities I think a person can have. I've got a fantastic history, fantastically deep culture, creative culture. goes back relatively cohesively for century upon century. But by this sort of constant dilution, is there an attempt, a deliberate attempt in Camus' view, to dissolve that cultural identity, for all the people to become simply Europeans or maybe simply people of the world. Hence, they would feel no particular allegiance to the country they're actually in. That's the big question. Now, I will admit my own ignorance at this point. I've not looked at it deeply enough. I intend to read as much of Camus' own view as I can, but also taking the counterpoint. You know, what are the arguments against? You know, what's the evidence to say this is not a process? It's a difficult one. At first glance, or second and third glance, it does seem that something is going on. It does seem quite evident. I think I read something last week that I think in the UK, both London and Birmingham, it is now the case with the demographics that the white British-born natives are the minority. So it's kind of, you know, it's kind of massive scale. It's like London's city of what, 8, 9, 10 million, whatever it is now, have you define it. The people who come from this country are actually in the minority. It makes you think. So, yeah, I'm still debating with myself as to the truth of this matter. Good morning. I really don't know for sure one way or the other. I know the balance of evidence seems to be pointing one way, but I don't want to plump down on one side or the other, or to give any sort of definitive opinion until I know a lot more about it. Hugely controversial, obviously, and I may come back to this after I educate myself a little more deeply on these ideas. Anyway, usual thing. I would say, particularly this week, go to my Substack, A Sexagenarian's View. It's me, like George McNally, because I'm able to kind of go into it in a little more depth and give quotes from a lot of the leading players, and you might get more of a feel of the essence of the book and the idea. Okay, I think that will do it for now. Usual thing, please comment. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. I seem to be doing better in the written form than this form, but I quite enjoy my little walk and talk. So for now, farewell. Thank you for viewing this.